Hello, today I'm going to be painting this desert scene with the reflections and quite a big sky. I generally don't do big skies because I find painting clouds quite difficult, but I thought let's give it a go. I think it turned out okay, so let me explain what I'm doing as I go. So early on separate layers to keep everything nice and neat, and so I can adjust things later, I put in the big shapes with base colors. The base color is generally the darker side because I'll highlight them later. I'm not too concerned about the colors as long as they're fairly close, because again I can adjust them later. I'm using the select freehand tool in Procreate with color fill turned on, so it means I can make big complicated shapes nice and quickly and with sharp edges, which is the important part. Because it's quite easy to soften them later with the tools like smudge. But in this style that I'm doing here, I don't smooth things very much, so this tool makes it quite easy. And if I do want to smudge things, which I do smudge the sky in a little bit, I'll just use the smudge tool and quite sparingly. So once I have the big shapes in, I'm going to add the highlights. Now, when I pick references to paint, I'll stick the reference of this up on the screen in a second. I look for things that have obvious highlights and shadows because it's more dramatic, and it makes it makes paintings more interesting when you have a big difference between the highlights and the shadows. So this one's fairly obvious. The entire foreground is in shadow actually, and one thing you got to be careful of is not to over highlight things if they're in shadow. So this is what I was talking about with the sky, and there's only like three really main colors. So what I'm doing is the sun's coming from the left, so that's the yellow part, and then it starts to fade. So we've got yellow to orange to purple, and really that is just the concept of it, and building them up in little sections so it kind of blends together without really blending. And then I'll put in the sky using Gaussian blurs, a nice trick. So rather than trying to paint smooth, I'm making big shapes with that tool again and putting it into the background sky, picking Gaussian blur and then bringing it to, it's usually about halfway, and it makes nice smooth gradients. So I'm going over those sky bits again using a tool called clipping mask. Well, it's not a tool, it's a setting on a layer. So if you create a layer above the block in that I already had and then choose clipping mask, it will conform to what's underneath and not go out of the area. So that's how you can see that I'm quite messy and quick, is because I use clipping mask a lot, and it makes sure that it stays in those early shapes that I did at the start. So it's quite important those shapes are nice, because it'll be quite hard to change them later. Not impossible, but a little bit tricky. And you save a lot of time if the shapes are correct in the beginning. Now, when I say correct, I don't follow the reference much. I'm just getting a gist. So I'm putting the reflection in, and I'm using the select tool again and saying copy canvas. Now, copy canvas just takes all the layers instead of just the one you're on. And then I'll transform it by flipping it vertically and then pulling it down into the pool thing. And so one thing I'm using there again is clipping mask above that pool layer, the lake layer, whatever it is, and just putting it into the right place. Now, usually I would mention to paint the bottom section, the reflection, because you don't want it almost exactly the same. But this one was a little bit complicated, so I didn't really want to paint that again. And now I'm using the adjustment tools in Procreate to lighten it a little bit, because it's a reflection and the sky water usually gets a bit brighter. So to mess it up a little bit, I'm using a smudge tool and just a simple soft brush, and making sure I go horizontally. I just mess up the reflection a little bit, because reflections are rarely perfect, and I don't want it to look too neat. In digital painting, if everything looks a bit too neat, it looks a bit fake. And so what I'm doing here is adding a shadow underneath the land where it hits the water, That's quite important, or it doesn't look like the land sits on the floor and the reflection will kind of look like it's not in the land. It'll look like it's on top. And I dropped the opacity a bit just because it's a bit too dark, but that's not such a big deal. So using that tool again on top of the land, I'm just adding some interest. Now, none of this is really, you know, what is it? It's just marks on the floor. It's just to break up the big purpley grey shape. And it doesn't really have to be anything specific. It's just so it's not too dull. And I'll adjust it again because I think it's a bit too dark. And so I want this to be subtle. Keep in mind that the entire bottom section is in shadow, so everything will be kind of dull, other than the reflection, because the reflection's so bright that it kind of sticks out again. But still, not as bright as this, not as colorful as the sky exactly. And remember, I use the smudge tool to mess it up a little bit. And so I'm adding a little bit of detail. Most of the time I'm not really using a brush, but I'm using the technical pen from the inking section when I do. It's just a simple little hard brush, but any brush will do really for this because I'm using it so little. It doesn't really matter. Most of the time I'm using that color fill in the select mode tool. So now I'm just adding still more bits of detail. You see this green shrubbery type thing that splits the painting. You got to make sure that it stands on the floor. It was floating a little bit, so one way to do that is just put a slightly softer color between two layers to make them blend in a little bit. So you just take that green and make it a little bit lighter, a little bit duller, so it blends the two layers together. And I'm adding some shrubbery in the front, not to overdo the detail because this is not the focus. And one thing you can do to make colors pop out a lot more in landscapes is add some gray here and there. Usually you could do this with rocks, which are quite nice, rocks and stones and pebbles and things. But in this landscape they would probably be bright orange anyway, so that wouldn't work so well. So these little shrubs there, they're kind of in the reference, but they're a little bit more colorful, but I thought I'd use gray, and they're kind of weird looking shrubs. They kind of look dead anyway, so gray is fine. So I'm adding a few effects now. So again, using that color fill tool, I'm putting in a blue color here, and I'll shift it. I'll make it a little bit brighter. And this may look weird right now, but wait a second, and you use Gaussian blur again, and it will blur into the background and kind of give a misty effect, like the some atmosphere is coming from the back and going in front of the mountain cliff things. And so I'm doing it again with red because I wanted to warm up the shadow section. So same again, Gaussian blur over the layer. This is on a new layer, and then I'll use the N. I'm not sure what N stands for, to be honest, but I'll use overlay for this one. So you got all sorts of modes that mix into the background or not. So overlay leaves the details underneath and just adds the color rather than messing around with the details. So just a few little subtle effects like that can make a big difference. So try some out. So that's it. If you liked that, give me a sub and a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.